Hello, everyone. My research topic is about the deterioration of gender equality at the hands of the Russian state. So, the question is basically why is the Russian government, the most significant contributor to the decline in women's rights in Russia? So, throughout the past century, Russia has been notable for having one of the lowest labor participation gaps in gender around the world. However, this gap has been slowly increasing in the recent years. So, in this paper, I'll argue that the Russian state is the most significant contributor to the deterioration of gender equality for Russian women due to the lack of helpful policy on gender inequality. The state's patriarchal propaganda under Vladimir Putin and Russia's intrinsic top-down state structure, which allows the state to suppress any grassroots movements not aligned with state ideology. I'll look at several cases dating back to the emergence of the Soviet Union to more recent policy changes under Vladimir Putin's government, such as the bill recognizing that feminism is an extremist ideology recently passed, or not passed, but suggested. So, my first argument for why the state is one of the most or the most significant contributor to gender equality's decline is the lack of helpful policy. So, we saw this in the early 20th century when, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks gave women the same rights as men in the labor force, gave them the same rights to divorce. But while this lessened the labor participation gap and led to major strides for Russian women compared to other countries at the time, for example, the US, Canada, this policy also ended up hurting women because they were expected to take on a full-time job in addition to housework and child rearing. So the duty of child rearing was still delegated to women. It was not also shifted onto men. And moreover, the demoralization of Russian men due to the Soviet Union taking away the incentives to work also led to the rise of alcoholism and therefore an increase in the domestic abuse situations and a greater dependency on women to manage the family. So you can see how this is kind of it was one step forward, two steps back kind of thing where women did achieve some parts of gender equality, such as, the reduction in the labor gap, but also, you know, they had to take on more responsibilities. They had to basically work doubly compared to men. And you may bring up a counterpoint that the presence of women in the labor market contributed to the increase of women in leadership positions. Isn't this a good thing? Well, while this is true because women were almost completely excluded from the labor force prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, research states that women were still viewed as more culturally backward than men, even after the revolution. Even though they were expected to devote their work to the state all the same, they were still viewed as less than. The presence of women in the labor force does not equate one-to-one with progress for women in terms of feminism, because many women in the Soviet Union held high-ranking positions but were still made to contribute less compared to men, which is still visible today in many governments across the world. My second argument is that the Russian government deteriorates Russian women's rights through its use of patriarchal propaganda. So, in the late 20th century, the Russian state quite often used notions of gendered roles in their propaganda as a political tool. I think we only see it the most intensely with Vladimir Putin in the past 20 or so years. For example, Pisklakova Parker states that gender inequality in the Russian Federation has been growing in the past few years due to the lack of a clear state policy addressing the problem, and a rise in propaganda of so-called traditional values, which are the patriarchal attitudes that I mentioned here towards the role division for women and men. The way that the state has increased patriarchal norms is simply through the creation of Vladimir Putin's image himself. So when Putin came into power, the economy was really struggling at that time. So he wanted to garner public support, and the previous leader was someone that Russians thought was a drunken man, who Russians thought was a person who couldn't hold his ground in international negotiations, and that was Boris Yeltsin. So when Putin came into power, he wanted to completely change up this image of the government, right? He assumed a stoic yet hyper-masculine demeanor that focused on athleticism and militarism to give the impression of Russia being a very strong country. And yes, this stoicism was a fresh start from the previous leader, Boris Yeltsin, who also assumed an image of hypermasculinity, but in a different way, and more so geared towards alcohol and cigarettes, that type of persona, rather than extreme sports. Yeah, so Russian citizens felt pride in Russia because of Putin's, well, some Russian citizens, I don't want to speak for all of them, but because of the strong image that Putin presented, Russian citizens felt pride, and the ratings for him went up. And this was obviously helped by, of course, the way that the economic reforms by Putin boosted Russia's GDP, which at the time was very bad, and the society was there was a lot of crime, and the GDP rates were very low. Well, the toxic side effect of this hypermasculine and crass persona is that it pushes the belief that domestic abuse is acceptable and even encouraged. Because Vladimir Putin, if he was only presenting as hypermasculine, that wouldn't be a problem, right? Be who you want to be. But he also has made like several misogynistic comments and jokes. He jokes about rape, and he seems to support it. And this type of crass attitude combined with hypermasculinity is what makes it is what creates the toxic side effect of the perpetuation of the stereotype of the narrative of a dominant man and a submissive wife. So support for him, it leads very quickly into support for, you know, bills about the decriminalization of domestic abuse, which it actually was decriminalized, partially. And this meme was pretty popular a few years ago. It's a perfect illustration of what Putin wants to portray himself as, out to the world as. Obviously, it's photoshopped, but yes, this image of hypermasculine, involved in extreme sports, cool, stoic, that kind of attitude, compared to Boris Yeltsin, who's accompanied with Bill Clinton on the right, who is more of the not so macho man type, and more like he was just a different type. Yeah, as I explained previously. And yeah, the GDP graphic that I also talked about, you can see here after Vladimir Putin came into power, GDP rose quite dramatically. I think this also contributed greatly to his garnering of public support. And my third argument is about the oppressive state structure of Russia. So, the Russian state is the most significant contributor to the deterioration of gender equality because Russia's intrinsic top-down state structure, authoritarian state structure, makes it so that the state suppresses any grassroots movements that are not aligned with the state ideology. So, for example, in April 2023, as we previously mentioned, the Russian state officially labeled feminists as political extremists. Well, the propaganda that encourages the quote unquote traditional family with the dominant husband and the submissive wife, this propaganda is so well propagated by Putin in conjunction with the Russian Orthodox Church that those who speak out about violence against women are met with death threats. So it is so entrenched that individual feminists cannot speak up without getting put back down. Another example of how these patriarchal norms are being implemented to oppress any feminist grassroots movements can be seen in media propaganda for the current war. So, for example, in state-sponsored programs, Putin aligns progressivists, feminists, feminist organizations in Russia. He aligns them with general, like the West, and general American cultural regression. That is, he's aligned anyone who does not follow these patriarchal norms he established with the US and with the quote unquote enemy, with Ukraine. And he does this in order to gain more support for the war. Yes, feminists are agents of the West, is what he portrays. Lastly, there is a counter argument to be made about Russian feminism and what Russian women perceive as gender equality. Can a society that is based on a patriarchal family structure also have gender equality or at least overall life satisfaction for women? Evidently, you may have noticed that a majority of Russian women may prefer a family structure wherein the man provides for them, but at the same time allows them to pursue their own career goals and aspirations. They may view what Americans think of as feminist acts, such as splitting the bill on a date, for example, to be aggressive or even hostile. However, it's hotly debated whether the first type described in Russian feminism, whether the Russian version of feminism would increase or decrease women's rights. Because, as studies show, a family structure where the man takes care, quote unquote, of the woman financially can lead to benevolent sexism. And benevolent sexism limits the desires of women to further their careers, ultimately leading to a wage gap and the perpetuation of the norm that leadership positions are more suited to men. But at the same time, it is a pretty popular belief among feminists that women should be able to choose their life path in a way that brings them the most contentment. So, whichever one that may be, despite anything, the patriarchal state that Russia espouses doesn't fit either of those types of feminisms, and it contributes to gender inequality in a way that, it, for one, decriminalizes some forms of domestic abuse against women. It has a leader that assumes a hypermasculine image that makes condescending jokes about sexual assault for his own political gain and to women's detriment. So, for my conclusion, I want to discuss why is Putin doing this? What's his end goal? So, in conjunction with the church, Putin is spreading state propaganda, basically He's spreading state propaganda about the importance of family life in order to firm up his political hold and support for the current war. And the oppressive state structure opposes any protests and movements in order to keep itself strong. That is why it is playing into this narrative so much of anti-Western. It views the West as anti-family, and it views Russia as, okay, we are the bulwark of family values. And what we understand as family values, which is the dominant man and the submissive wife, that is the stereotype that we are going to project onto the entirety of Russia. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.